Yes, the meeting is recording. And I'll just start to take this adherent with your permission, Chair. Councillor Allison, I see that you're here. Councillor Anderson?
Here.
I see that Councillor Bradley is here and also Councillor Brown. Councillor Callaghan?
Here.
Councillor Chalmers?
Here.
Councillor Cornbury?
Here.
Councillor Cooper? Nothing from Councillor Cooper. Thank you. Councillor Corbett is here. Councillor Craig is here. Councillor Devlin is here. Councillor Dorman is here. Councillor Fagan?
Here.
Councillor Hamilton?
Here.
Councillor Logan is here. Councillor Loudon is here. Councillor Lowe? Councillor Lowe, nothing from Councillor Lowe. I have a message from Councillor McAdams to say that she is experiencing difficulties. Perhaps we could get IT support onto that one. Thank you. And we'll check with Councillor McAdams' presence later. Councillor McCreary, you're here. Councillor McGuigan?
Yes.
Councillor Miller is here. Councillor Nealon is here. Councillor Nelson?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Councillor Nelson. Councillor Ross is here. Councillor Shearer is here. Councillor Wardhaw is here, and Councillor Wilson is also here. I'm not aware of any substitutes attending today. None have been intimated. So we'll hand back to you, Chair. Thank you very much.
Pauline, you didn't shout my name, Alan Faulkner.
Councillor Faulkner, I do beg your pardon. I have actually marked you as present, so my apologies for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Pauline. We'll start with meeting. Is there any declaration of interest? No. Move on to item 2, which is minutes of the previous meeting. Is there any business arising from the minutes of the previous meeting? I see a hand up there. Pauline, is that
Councillor Brown's hand is up.
Yes, thanks very much, John. I put it up earlier on. I wanted to ask, following on Pauline's comment about the meeting being recorded, what the current state of play was on that being made available to the public, because as far as I'm aware, that's not obvious on the website at the moment, and I thought it was intended to happen quite quickly. Can I have some clarification on that?
Yes, you certainly can.
Chair, I can advise of the current position with regard to the recording. We have actually sourced a subtitling company, and the first meeting has gone to the subtitling company. It's come back to us for a proofread and a check. We have checked that, and we're hopefully it will be put on a public platform shortly, and thereafter we'll take other meetings and get them uploaded also. I hope that helps.
I suppose the follow-up point, Chair, is just how long it's going to be between the meetings of the committee and the thing going up on the website. Because if this is going to be like a month or something, it's almost pointless. It's going to be a day or so. That's a different ball game.
Yeah, that was going to be my question, Robert. So yes, that certainly demands an answer. Have we any idea how quickly we'll be able to turn that around?
Chair, can you hear me now? Sorry.
Yes, Paul.
Paul, okay, so the process Pauline has explained, right, has taken so long because this is the first time we were doing this, right? And the film of the meeting had to be sent through. They in turn came back with a subtitled version, right, which had to be checked by the committee clerks for accuracy in that case. They've identified some issues with the process that we'll be able to work around in the future. So it's not going to be anything like the length of time that it has been to get this initial meeting up and running. So I don't know if anything Geraldine wants to add on that, because Geraldine's been involved in the process in a great deal of detail.
Geraldine.
Thank you, Chair. Chair and Councillor Brown, to meet the requirements of the disability accessibility regulations, the meeting has to be subtitled. Recordings have to be subtitled before they're uploaded, and we had to source a company that would do that, which we have. It took some time to just explain what the process would be that we wanted them to do. But last night I did receive the finalised version of the executive committee, so that will be uploaded to YouTube today, the subtitled version. And then obviously we wanted to see the standard of the company before we forwarded the other meetings to them. But we're happy that they have met the standard we would have anticipated, and we'll send the rest to them today.
Thanks, Geraldine. And do we have any idea then of the turnaround time that we can expect for future meetings?
They have indicated that they normally work to a 2 working day turnaround time to get you the first proof. It depends on the quality of the recording. They may have to, they had a bit of interaction with us because they couldn't pick up some of the wording where the sound dropped off as members lost connection the last time. I'm hoping that we don't have the same issues in all of the committees as we did then. We may have a bit of that, but I'm hopeful that we will be able to resolve it, because we were able to fill in the blanks from our notes that we had taken at the meeting and pass them back to them.
Right, thanks very much, Geraldine. So I presume we're looking at as fast a turnaround as is possible, and certainly probably you're talking roughly about a week to 10 days. Is that safe to say that that would be a margin where we could look at turning things round?
Yes, it should be. I mean, it does take some time to proofread the transcript when it comes back, because they send you an Excel spreadsheet, so you have to listen to it and then mark up all your changes.
Okay, thanks. Robert, do you want to come back on that? Are you okay with that?
Well, it's obviously helpful information. I'm bound to say it sounds as if we're heading into a bit of a cul-de-sac here, as opposed to the issue of direct recording and available to the public at the time. But I appreciate the issues. We'll see how the thing works through for the first instance, I think.
Okay, thanks, Robert. I mean, I know the ultimate would be if we can actually live stream, etc., which is somewhere down the road where we want to go. But certainly, if we can try and turn that around as quickly as possible, I think that would be to everybody's advantage. I see Lynn has her hand up. I'm not sure who else.
Chair, we have Councillor Nealon, Councillor Loudon, Councillor Anderson, and Paul Manning has indicated that he wishes to speak as well.
Thanks very much.
Sorry, are you waiting for me now?
Yeah.
Just a quick question. Is this transmission, is it audio with subtitles, or is it audio visual with subtitles?
It is audio visual with subtitles, Councillor Nealon.
So our home or backdrops can be viewed by the public?
Yes, they can.
Thank you.
Okay. I think it was
Councillor Loudon,
Councillor Loudon next. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chair. Excuse me. Thank you, Geraldine, for talking us through that a bit. I think it's fantastic that these are going to be fully accessible and that they're going to be subtitled. Well, I shouldn't say fully accessible because we don't have BSL on them, but they're more accessible because we're going to have subtitles. It does sound like a very convoluted process, not just in terms of the time, but in the amount of work that goes into that. And I'm just conscious that we haven't had any discussion about how much of a cost that's going to be to the council if every meeting is going out to an external company and then coming back in. I wondered if you could tell us more about that.
Councillor Loudon, I think Paul has his hand up.
Paul,
yes,
maybe you have some idea there.
Listen, Chair, just to pick up on Councillor Loudon's point, that there are two things that are going to be happening right now. What was agreed at the December meeting was, after an amendment which came from members, what was agreed was that we would trial a live stream event at the Finance and Corporate Committee in March. Now that will happen next month, and Geraldine and Brian Tees have already been heavily involved in what is a low-cost solution in terms of broadcasting this on the internet, right? And that will happen live. What can't happen at that point is subtitling, right? Because I don't have a live, real-time subtitling service that's capable of giving us an accurate account of the meeting right at the foot of the page. But what we do have to do under the equalities legislation, as Geraldine's described before, and as we talked about in December, if we're going to put up a recorded version, we have to have an accurate, accessible subtitle. So we have to, we have tried a number of methods to do that. We've tried using the thing that's built in at Teams. It's not sufficiently accurate, right, to give something that we could put up to the public. So we are having to send something away in order to have it subtitled. It has to be reviewed when it comes back, right, and then it's basically burned in, which means it can't be altered at a later date, which is another consideration that we have to have in this. So there is a cost of this, right, and Geraldine will give you an idea of that cost per meeting, right. We are looking at a longer term contractual arrangement which could get a minimal cost per meeting, right, but we'd obviously have to commit to that for a length of time. Geraldine will give you an idea as to what the cost will be for the initial meetings, but what I'm telling you is I'm looking for a procurement method that would try and nail that down on behalf of the council. But it's a necessary step that we have to do in order to be compliant when we're putting up the recorded version after the fact. So thanks. Geraldine, I don't know if there's anything you wish to add to that.
Thanks, Paul. Councillor Loudon, we negotiated an introductory cost for the first meeting. The cost depends on the length of the meeting, and the Special Executive Committee was 38 minutes, and the introductory cost we negotiated was £300 for 38 minutes. Obviously, the meetings that are longer, the costs will increase, but we have started the process to negotiate a contract to get a reduced rate to encapsulate all the meetings.
Yeah, that would seem to me to be something that we really need to look at if it's going to cost us that sort of amount of money for every meeting. We really need to be looking at doing something in-house or doing something else. However, we'll leave that for another day. I think Councillor Anderson was the next person that wanted to speak.
Thanks, Chair. I think the whole crux of the matter is if we want a faster turnaround and a cheaper mode of doing it, we need a lot less grandstanding for a lot of the members. They like to talk for the sake of talking. So cut it out. This question could have been asked offline, and we've spent 15 minutes so far on it, and we're still at the minutes.
Well said, John.
Right, thank you very much for that piece of information, John. I'm not sure if Paul still wants to speak. No. Okay, can we move on then?
Councillor Allison, Chair.
Oh, sorry, Councillor Allison.
Yeah, I'm quite sure that won't be considered grandstanding, John. You've said that recorded meetings need to have are covered by the Disability Act, etc. Live streaming, is that covered as well, or is there no need for signing, etc. during them?
There is no need for subtitling, Councillor Allison, of live streamed meetings. If we have a signer available, then the signer will be pinned. So to answer Councillor Loudon's question before, we did have a signer, a BSL signer at the Special Executive Committee meeting, and that person was pinned and is visible on the screen. But unfortunately, well, not everyone can interpret the sign language, can understand sign language. So you are required to have both sign language, BSL if you can, or subtitling. It's an and/or.
Alec, you okay with that?
Aye, sorry, I clicked the wrong button there. Thank you.
Right, okay. Fine, if no members have got other questions on this item, can we move on to the minutes of the special meeting? That's item 3 on the agenda. Is there any feedback from the minutes of this meeting? No? Fine. Can we then move on to the monitoring items, items 4 to 7? And the first of these is item 4, the capital programme. And I would ask Paul to give us a report on this, please.
Okay, thanks, Chair. This is, as you say, it's the capital programme. It's the period that takes us up to the 1st of January 2021. There is a feature about both the capital programme and the revenue programme monitoring statements that you get this time, and they include the probable outturn exercise. So this is an exercise we do across November and December to try and get an accurate picture, or as accurate as we can get it, of what the year-end position is likely to be. Now, there is a small movement in the capital programme, which you can see at 4.1 in the paper, and it's an increase of £627,000. Now, that related to Our Lady of Lourdes Primary School in East Kilbride. You can see the detail in Appendix 1. That was actually something that had been through the Education Committee. That actually gets picked up in a paper later on in the agenda. So that's why we're making this adjustment. It was a relatively late point in the year. At the top of the second page, we have some content about accounting requirements. Now, this is an output of the probable outturn exercise that I described. And one of the things that we do is make sure that the spend that we're making through the capital programme is actually going to be classed as capital spend at the end of the year. And there's a wee bit of explanation given at 4.2 and 4.3 on that. And actually, it explains at 4.3 that some of the expenditure going through the revenue account more properly belongs in capital. So there's a bit of movement between the two streams of expenditure, and we have to have a bit of movement as well in terms of how that's funded. So that's described there. And it basically means that the amount of spending and amount of budget of £4.1 million is going to be moved across to the revenue budget. So that explains this movement in the programme. There is a point made at 4.4, and it gets picked up again at 4.6 about costs of COVID. Now, one of the things that I've been reporting across the year in the capital programme is the fact that there is an allowance in the capital programme for COVID-related spend. And one of the points that I'm making is, actually, when we get to the end of the year, depending on how processes around fiscal flexibilities work, I might look to move that between the capital and revenue spend programmes. I might look to move it out of capital and into revenue. And you get an explanation as to why we might do that at 4.7. And it comes down to the fact that I don't know at this point how these fiscal flexibilities are going to work and how the council might qualify to use them. So I might need to show that extra spend relating to COVID in the revenue programme in order to take advantage of that. But I'll keep you fully appraised of that as we report between now and the end of the year. So in terms of the recommendations that are within the programme, they look for noting of the position on the general fund and also on the housing programme, which you can see at section 5. That's got a programme of £48 million, and we expect to spend that much on the housing programme. That you approve that adjustment in terms of Our Lady of Lourdes School. And there's also a point made in there at 2.13. There's actually a saving on part of the roads investment programme. Jobs came in cheaper than we had budgeted. So in carrying that forward, we're looking for approval to spend that on additional projects next year in 2021-22. So those are the recommendations in terms of that capital paper. Chair, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much, Paul. Do any colleagues have any questions to ask of the officers on this item?
Chair, I don't see any hands.
Can we agree the recommendations, colleagues?
Agreed.
Agreed. Thank you. To move on then to item 5, which is the revenue budget, and I would ask Paul to give a report on this, please.
Okay, again, Chair, takes us to the 1st of January, and it includes this probable outturn exercise. So this exercise where we try and look at what the spend is going to be at the end of the year. And what the main new content in the paper, because as I've explained to you before, just given the nature of this year, this has become a fairly lengthy report. We've tried to pull together at section 4 in an executive summary. And what I'll draw your eye to, if you can go to 4.4, there's a table here that gives the updated position, and it also just links in with what we've reported before. Now, at the start of that table, you can see a figure of £36 million. And that's the overall cost of COVID, even after having taken into account a whole series of grants that have come from the government. We get to that figure of £36 million. Now, remember, and we've reported this across the year, there are costs that we've dealt with internally. So, for example, that amount of money that I talked about being charged to the capital programme, that's nearly £8 million that was dealt with that way. There were also costs that were charged to the housing revenue account, and that deals with about £31 million worth of cost. But I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that as a council, we're taking those steps in order to deal with that overall level of expenditure. What you'll see in the third line in that table is a figure which we've reported to as a sort of rump cost in terms of COVID, or expected overspend at the end of the year. And that's been the figure that's been reported for about the past 6 months, that figure of £4.6 million of a projected overspend. Now, what I bring in the line below that, it says loss of income funding from the government, and that's covered further in section 5.2. You will remember we've reported in these reports previously, there was an amount of money, it totaled £90 million nationally that was going to come from the government in respect of compensating councils for income that they'd lost across the year as a result of the pandemic. So we've picked up a share of that of £2.755 million. So I'm taking that away from that previously projected overspend of 4.6 to get a figure we've described as a shortfall in COVID funding. So that would be, at that point, an expected overspend of £1.9 million. As a result of the probable outturn exercise, I'm identifying another £441,000 of issues. They're covered in sections 6.11 and 6.15. After that, though, I'm focusing on a figure that's down there of over recovery of council tax, and there's a couple of big factors in that I think we need to take into account. Probably the biggest is an underspend at this point in the year, right? And by this point, I mean December, on council tax reduction scheme. So we're underspent against that, and this has gone into in a bit of detail at 4.9 by £810,000. You will remember we did get more money towards council tax reduction scheme during the year from the government. So the overspend is against that higher amount of budget. Sorry, the underspend is against the higher amount of budget. That, though, reflects demand in December. And if I'm being honest with you, that work is done prior to the latest wave of lockdown that we've gone into, and obviously the restrictions that related to that. And there is the possibility, and this gets picked up at 4.10, that they're going to impact further on people's personal circumstances, and I may see an upswing in demand for that council tax reduction money between December and the end of the year. So that's one we need to keep an eye on and report to you as the year concludes. The other big part of the council tax underspend is income for second homes, and later on in the paper there's a reference to the fact that that in turn gets passed on to the housing revenue account. So going back to the table I was taking you through a second ago, by the time we get to that, I'm reporting an outturn position of an underspend of just over £250,000. But I would stress the fact that, first of all, in terms of council tax, that underspend is based on a picture of December, and a lot could change towards the end of the year. And probably even more fundamentally, the expenditure figures that are in there as well are framed around December. And again, things moved, and in this year, they'll move like they've not moved in any other year. and we need to keep an eye on the position as we move towards the end of the year. Now, in terms of the other sort of content that's there in the executive summary, at 4.11, we're picking something that I reported, first of all, back in December, and that related to the fact that we had an underspend in relation to loan charges, which I was suggesting at that point was £3 million, and we could look to make a transfer to 3 funds: the Winter Maintenance Fund, the Insurance Fund, and the Strategic Waste Fund. So that was covered in there. We are also, as part of this probable outturn exercise, and again, we do this every year at this point in time, we're proposing an additional transfer of £7.5 million. That figure is 7.574 to reserves, and you can see that covered in detail in Appendix 3, which is on page 35 of your papers. Now, that amount of money of £7.574 million, the majority of the additional amount that we're looking to transfer relates to education, and it's 2 things, and most of you will be familiar with these from previous years. Probably about £2.5 million of it relates to the Pupil Equity Fund, right? So the Pupil Equity Fund money that we're given stretches across a school year, but obviously a school year goes beyond the end of the financial year. So there's a bit of that I need to carry forward to next year. The other big part of that education amount that we're looking to take into next year relates to early years grant. So we've been given grant as scheduled by the government in order to fund the early years expansion. And as you're aware, that was delayed because of the pandemic. So we're in a position where we're carrying that grant into next year to help meet the costs of that early years expansion. So it is a lengthy paper. Most of the key items are covered in that executive summary. In terms of the recommendations, going back to 2.1 on page 23, we're looking for noting of the position that I've described. Noting this year it's a wee bit different, and the potential for the outturn position may change depending on current COVID restrictions. At 2.13, we are looking for approval of those transfers to reserves totalling £10.5 million. I'm noting that point I made on the capital programme and the underspend positions on the general fund revenue account and the housing revenue account. So having taken you through that, Chair, I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul, for that lengthy report. Do any colleagues have any questions for Paul? I see Robert's got his hand up.
Thanks very much, John. A relatively small point. In 616, we talk about the pay-related budgets and the level of budget required to fund the auto-enrolment scheme. Now, bearing in mind the importance of that longer term to people on lower incomes, I wonder if we had any explanation as to why that was underspending, so to speak, and if it was one of these things where we're required to do anything particular to try and encourage more people to take up the scheme if there's too many opt-outs or whatever.
Paul?
Okay, listen, happy to pick that up, Chair. Councillor Brown, you'll remember this from previous years, and what we're obliged to do periodically, right, and this is every couple of years, is to take everybody who has a pension scheme and put them in it, right, and then it's up to them if they want to come out, right, and by doing that, I suppose you can't take a more fundamental step than essentially placing everybody in the pension scheme and asking them to make their way out of it. So we put aside an amount of money to pay for the additional costs that we thought would come from auto-enrolment. We've got 2 factors in there. One is the number of people who were actually placed in a position where they had to be auto-enrolled, and then the other factor is those who chose to come out. So I'm happy to provide further details as to why people don't remain in the scheme and the steps that we take to try and encourage that. But we absolutely fundamentally, follow the letter of the law. We place them in it. We promote the benefits of the pension scheme to them. But some people will still choose to come out, I'm afraid.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Okay, Robert, is there any other colleague have any questions? Nope, I would move the recommendations.
I'll second, Chair.
Are we agreed to accept the recommendations?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. Can we then move on to item 6, which is a revenue budget update. Now, all members should have received a follow-up item here, and I think that Paul is going to take us through it. If anybody hasn't received that, then they should let us know just now, but everybody should have received that. Paul, would you like to take us through it?
Right, thanks, Chair. So what I'm going through, just as the Chair said, is the updated paper, right, that was distributed earlier on in the week. And what that does, and this obviously couldn't be included in the pack of papers that was sent out, is to try and capture the output of the financial settlement process for local government, which has come from the government the week before last, and the impact on the council of that. So the paper starts off at section 4, and it actually goes through some content, first of all about capital grant. And I'll cut a long story short. What happened was you set your capital budget back in December based on assumed figures or an estimated figure that we had given you, right? And actually the estimated figure was based on the capital grant that we were getting for 2020-21, which did mark a bit of a decrease from the previous year. Now, unfortunately, that's proven to be pretty accurate. So the level of capital grant that we're getting is going to be £21.362 million. It's a modest increase on what we'd included in that December paper. And what we're suggesting is that officers come back to a future meeting of the committee with proposals for the use of that additional money. We also got, as part of the settlement, £2.1 million, right, of specific grant for vacant and derelict land expenditure, and also cycling, walking and safer streets. So again, those are for specific purposes, and we would look to bring back a programme for development and agreement with elected members again in due course. So I don't know, maybe first of all, if I can break there, if anybody's got any questions on the capital.
Does any colleague have any questions at this point?
No hands raised, Chair.
Thank you, Paul. Fine.
I'll press on then, right, and go through section 5 onward, which deals with the revenue budget. Now, what you've got a bit of preamble there. It's at a 5.1 about how this works, right, and what the settlement package goes towards. The settlement at 5.2 includes funding for those councils who agreed to freeze their council tax at the 2020-21 level. So that's a pretty fundamental point in this, right, and in this year's settlement from government to local government. So 5.3 describes the various sections of the paper, and in 5.4 what I talk about is the movement in the grant. And I'll avoid going through in detail 5.4. It takes you through what the overall grant allocation is and how that compares to last year's grant. What we're picking out though is this final sentence. See, if I compare the 2 years allocations, you're getting a year-on-year increase in cash of £15.456 million, right? But you just need to be aware that's not perfectly on a like-for-like basis, right? And so section 5.5 goes on to try and explain that, and I explain it again further in a table, which are in two tables, which you can see, tables 1 and table 2, right? But I'll come back to that in a second. There are monies in that £15.456 million which are for specific things, right? So the biggest of them is money that has to go to the integrated joint board, right? £4.224 million. We've described another amount there is money for new responsibilities, £3.716 million. That's by and large coming for increases in specific grant, and a big part of that relates to early years education. So I need to take that from the £15.5 million, because those two amounts have got a specific road to go down. So those commitments total £7.9 £1.35 million. So when I take those away, what we're getting is a year-on-year, like-for-like increase, right, which is described at the end of section 5.6. It's £7.521 million, right? So the grant has gone up. Point I would make there is that increase in grant, you'll understand, includes this amount of money that you're being given in order to compensate for freezing council tax. So what we go on then to describe, there are another couple of amounts that at this stage in the budget process I think we can put back on the table. And one of them is picked up at 5.8, and it relates to movements in specific GAE funding lines. Now this is the GAE funding lines, this is the route through which the government calculates the amounts of money that are coming to councils for very specific things. And there are movements in these lines, and we've got corresponding lines in our expenditure budget which we can adjust because of those. And what that means is there's an extra £901,000 makes its way into the bottom line in terms of our budget process. At the top of the next page, we talk about non-domestic rates. And what this comes down to is the fact that we'd put into the budget an amount of money for an increase in rates poundage, which we expected would come into play, and which in turn the council would need to pay for its properties. That hasn't happened, right? So that £720,000 is available to you as well. So having worked our way through these things, what I'm saying in section 5.10 in table 1 is, in comparison to the revenue budget strategy that we had, the position's improved by just over £12.5 million. That figure of £12.591 million that you can see in the bottom right hand corner of table 1, right, at 5.10. Now what I do then is to say, okay, how does that compare to what we'd mapped out in the paper that I brought to the Executive Committee back in January? And that I've tried to do in table 2. And this is probably the bit in this paper that I'll dwell on most, right? So what you've got in table 2, right, and this is at the end of section 6, is something that shows you've got a column. First of all, it's headed up per January Exec Committee. So this is where we pitched the budget when we brought it to you in that paper in January. And then I've tried to compare what the position is after the settlement. And you'll remember in that paper in January, we were saying, look, we've got to a savings requirement of £17.53 million. If you were going to put up council tax by the maximum that you could have put it up last year, which was about 4.9%, you could bring in £6.8 million. And we also put on the table those management and operational decisions at £5.762 million. Now, working through those, there would have been a balance of savings required of £4.958 million. And there was obviously a package of savings options there, which was getting close to £15 million, from which you could select options to bridge that gap. So if I move across right to that column that says per settlement, this is what it looks like after that financial settlement and after we've had that improvement in our position of £12.591 million. And I'm adjusting, first of all, for two big figures in there. One is, it says reduction in grant per budget strategy. So in the budget strategy, we were factoring in, right, we were estimating that we would get a 1% cut in grant. And that topped up with a couple of things, adjustments on our grant, right, because we take in more council tax, was bringing down, or it was adding to our savings requirement £10.25 million, £10.259 million. So in reality, that hasn't happened. So I can take that off of my savings requirement. And the other amount that I can take off the savings requirement is that figure of £7.521 million, because the grant hasn't gone down, right? It's actually increased by that amount. Now, two other things, right, that I've just talked about a moment ago. We've got that £901,000, which is there's an appendix at the rear that goes through that in detail. That's made up of a whole number of movements in budget lines. And we've also got this extra that we've got in our hand because the rates poundage hasn't gone up. So what that takes us from, if you look at that table, is a savings requirement of £17.53 million through to a figure that's in brackets, right? And you'll see further down on the table, what that means is there's actually capacity for investment in the budget of £1.871 million. Now, if you add to that the management and operational decisions, right, the value from those, that takes us to a figure of £7.633 million. And that is summarised at the bottom. That's your improvement in position of £12.591 million. So bottom line at the end of that table, what I'm saying is there is, at this stage in the budget process, capacity for investment of £7.633 million. There's a couple of factors that I just need to bring to your attention, right, in getting to that point. And the first of those is covered in section 7. Now, what we're talking about there is pay and what we have in the budget for pay award. And one of the things that was announced at the same time as the settlement was the Scottish Government's public sector pay policy. Now, that doesn't directly impact on local government because the pay for local government employees isn't decided by the government, it's negotiated by local government. But in my opinion, what's being put on the table by the Cabinet Secretary in that settlement may well influence what happens within the local government negotiations. And what was contained within that settlement was what you would describe as a bottom-loaded pay award. And what was talked about was 3% for those earning up to £25,000 and a minimum in that of £750. It went on to talk about 1% for higher paid employees, right? And a cap for those earning over £80,000. What I'm saying is, I think if something like that was replicated, or aspects of that were replicated in the local government pay settlement, I would need more money in order to pay that. And that's why I'm saying there's an amount of £3 million that I think you would need to take from that 7.633 in order to properly fund a pay award that we may well end up with. That's one part of this. Another aspect of it that I'm going to draw attention to in section 8 is, and particularly as we get to section 8.5, it may be worth considering, right, if as members you choose to undertake planned investments, consider how permanent you make them. Right now, I don't know what next year's settlement's going to be. We're getting settlements 1 year at a time, and we have done for a period of years. An aspect of that settlement next year, which I definitely don't know at this point, is whether that compensation for the council tax freeze money would get baselined, right, or built into next year's money. So that's a potential risk as we move forward. To the point I'm drawing attention to, section 8.5 is consideration that could be given, right, to one-off investments that could allow that money to be taken into account when we're putting together the 2022-23 budget. Section 8, in more general terms, goes through next steps. So it gives it section 8.1 details of how the budget bill is going to progress through Parliament, right? And the fact is picked up at 8.2. We don't yet have final confirmation because of that process through Parliament of what our budget is definitely going to be. And at 8.3, I'm saying there is the possibility that more money could make its way forward. But if anything, right, was notified to us in respect to that, it would be brought back to members for consideration. In section 8.4, we're making the point that we've scheduled a budget meeting for the 24th of February, and it refers back again to that figure of £7.633 million. So going back to the recommendations, right, the things that are in here, Chair, are for noting. right? And it's really just referring to that settlement and that improvement in the budget strategy position of £12.5 million. But I would ask that those factors around, particularly the potential for extra cost in terms of pay award, be noted. So having gone through that, thank you, Chair. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much, Paul. I think there's an item there, Paul, that where the council tax has been fixed before, it has been baselined in future years. And I know that COSLA, all parties at COSLA are fighting very hard to make sure that we get some sort of confirmation that if it's accepted this year, that it will be baseline for future as well. But certainly I'll open it up to colleagues. It is quite a lengthy report, and I'll open it up to colleagues if they've got questions to ask of Paul. Please let us know.
Chair, I don't see any hands raised.
Oh, thank you very much.
Councillor Fagan.
Councillor Fagan.
Yeah, a few observations and just to point out how it might impact on us. And I should say, I have to say that was very comprehensive, Paul, and I appreciate it was very comprehensive and drawn together at quite short notice in the grand scheme of things. So I'm loath to be one of these people that makes their contribution to the committee. I welcome the report, but because there's a lot in there that's still very challenging, but I do think that there's a lot of information in there in a short space of time. I think the settlement's better than anticipated, obviously, but I have to say what we were anticipating was a settlement that would have required a pretty appalling and unprecedented set of cuts in this council. I think it's also the case that it falls significantly short of what COSLA said was fair and necessary, and actually in revenue terms, probably less than half of what was required.
Joe, I know that you're trying to come out, but really I'm looking for questions at this point. No comments on the general settlement. That's for another day.
Well, the question, I suppose, then, is that if we're in the position where we've had a settlement that is better than expected, but still falls substantially short of what is required, and what our trade unions also say is required, if we're also in a position where, if we look to next year and I think the 4 years beyond that 5-year period, in which I'm assuming we are still anticipating a budget gap in the region of £83 million, and maybe Paul can confirm if that's still the case, then a lot of the cuts that we may be able to take off the table this year are likely to return year after year, next year and the year after that for consideration. So I take the point that, and I agree with you in this one, Chair, that we need as much clarity as possible on whether the council tax compensation money is baselined. But can also suggest we need as much clarity as possible on how much of this budget settlement that is here this year reflects the circumstances in which local government is operating this year and is therefore likely to be there in the next year. So I'm wondering if there is any intelligence that Paul can offer us on that. I think the suggestion there is that it might not be, and therefore be careful with the spending choices you make this year. And that then takes us to a position as if there's already been a shift in budget against what was anticipated, is there the potential for further movement? And if there is the potential for further movement, then how would that impact on, right now we're working to the assumption that we'll be setting a budget on the 24th of February, and I think that's quite sort of fair and reasonable in keeping with previous years, but given the process has been later and there's been shift later in the process, should we consider whether the 24th of February is the appropriate day on which to set the budget? And well, the only other point I was going to make was a political point I'll maybe save for another day, but it was to say that if the budget is less than half of what's anticipated and we want local government to be in a strong negotiating position, then can I suggest to you, Leader, that maybe it's the best thing to do is not to welcome a settlement that is less than half of what we asked for?
Joe, I'm not going to take any political statements, but what I will say is that all political parties through COSLA are working hard to get the maximum funding for local government that they can. So that's all I'm going to say at this moment on that one. Paul, would you like to come back and try and answer some of Joe's questions there?
Okay, can you hear me okay, Chair? Right, from, I suppose, just the first point picking out around section 8.1, right, and the progression of the bill through Parliament. I've got no expectation, right, at this point that there is going to be any extra money, right, or that money will come forward late in the day. I'm just making the point that the bill has to go through those processes. So the councils have had their budget settlement. I would imagine if there was potential for further money, right, that might have either been flagged as part of that documentation, or we would had word about through some other route. So right now I've got no expectation of other money. I'm just making the point that it could happen, right? So right now the settlement is the settlement. There are obviously, you know, stages to be gone through in terms of Parliament, and I believe as well coming from the UK government to the Scottish government in addition to that. Right, so again, if anything comes up that changes that, I'll make my way to the Chief Executive and leaders and make that known as soon as possible.
Paul, can I ask if there were further monies to become available after we set our budget, what would the procedure be then?
Basically, right, I think as soon as we have, there's two factors in this. One is the sort of process around it, and the second thing is the position that you find yourself in as a result of having a better settlement than we had factored into our budget strategy. So in net terms, you have got capacity to invest in the budget, and the points made in the paper, you can augment that through taking savings, right? And that's obviously, you know, an issue for political discussion. So at the moment, your budget is in a position where you would probably be looking at you know, things that you would look to undertake as you know, investment items, and I've made my point in there about the permanence of those, right? So if additional money came, part of the logic I would argue is you're probably going to put on the table additional expenditure items, additional investment items, and there would be scope at a point in the future, obviously across, I'd imagine March, to come back, for officers to come back with a paper summarising if there was extra money, the extent of that, the impact in the budget, and what we could look to do with it. A factor in this, though, is remember we do need to set council tax, right, as part of the overall budget setting process, and that does have a legislative deadline, right? It's got two deadlines. The first is a legislative deadline, which is the 11th of March. So the council tax has to do that. The council tax has to be set by that point. The other thing that we do need to do is get our bills printed and out, right, which has been a time limiting factor in the past. So my suggestion is still, given what we know at the moment, that we progress to set up a budget on, or we don't, you do, on the 24th of February, and that I keep you updated as to if and whether any extra monies are allocated and what the impact of that could be for decision for yourselves as to what was done with any additional money that comes forward. So I don't know if I've helped things there, Chair.
No, that's great, Paul. Margaret, I see you've got your hand up.
Yes, I think it's rather disingenuous, Joe, to say that we're running late with the setting of the budget process. There's 4 group leaders and their groups have been working very hard over 5 meetings over a period of weeks now to look at the budget, and the Labour group were disinclined to attend that. So I don't see us being anywhere behind at all. I think we're well ahead, and the only differentials that are likely to come are extra funding that Paul's referred to a few minutes ago. We're not behind. We're working to the same programme as we've worked to in previous years. Other people have been around longer than me, but over the last 9 years, we've always tried to head towards setting the budget in February to allow Paul to take forward his council tax and his rent and his various bills he's got to get out. And it's disingenuous to the other groups to say that we're running late when we've We've been actually, everyone in the other groups have been working extremely hard to get us to the position that we hope to be in. Thank you, John.
Thanks very much, Margaret. I appreciate the comments, but we're trying to keep this now to questions so that we can move on.
Chair, the Scottish budget was later than usual, was the point I was making. The other points about the budget working group I can make elsewhere.
Thanks very much, Joe. Alec, I think your hand's up as well.
Yeah, just quickly, John, just confirm the process if the Scottish budget, when it goes through committee, does give more money to local authorities. That comes back to us. Will that be dealt with by full council or by the executive?
Paul?
Right. Okay, we would come back with a paper to the executive committee first of all, and then that would be carried on the subsequent council meeting.
Yeah.
Sorry,
okay,
just
Alec.
confirm the decision will be taken at council.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Okay, I'm going to move the recommendations if there's no other comments.
I'll second, Chair.
Is there anyone else opposed? No. Can we agree the recommendations?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. Can we now move on to item 7, which is additional funding from the Scottish Government? And Paul, can you speak to this, please?
Right. Thanks, Chair. So this is a paper that comes here on its way to the council, right? And it goes through these 3 sets of information, right, which are related. And it's about the council's borrowing and investments, right? So it goes through the Prudential Code indicators, and there for a period of years to 2023-24, the council's Treasury management strategy and our annual investment strategy. So we bring these here every year. The first part is about the Prudential Code indicators. You can see this at section 4.
Chair.
Chair,
No, I think you're on
7.
Yeah, you're on the wrong item, Paul.
7 would be additional funding.
You're muted, Paul.
Sorry, right, additional funding from Scottish Government and other external sources. What we've got, you can see this on page 50 of your papers, right? We've got a number of additional items, right? And this characterises this year. We've had a whole stream of monies coming through. So you can see there, I think there's around 10 items. They come to £9.963 million. There are 5 items in there that make up 9/10 of that. And you can see them in that column. You've got money coming through here for business grants. You've got money coming in for this amount I referred to earlier on, the COVID loss of income, £2.75 million. Employability money relating to the Scottish Youth Guarantee at 1.655, and money for social work in terms of winter plan for social protection. So those are the additional funds. They have been reflected in the other papers you've got. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Paul. Does any colleague have any questions? No, I would move the recommendations.
I'll second, Chair.
Can we agree?
Agreed.
Agreed. Thank you very much. Now, Paul, we can move on to item 8, which is prudential indicators. And I would just say ahead of this that after Paul's given his report, he's going to be asking colleagues questions to make sure everybody's read the reports. Okay. Paul.
Okay, thanks, Chair. I've collected myself now. This should be the right report. So we've got item 8, right, which is the prudential indicators, the Treasury management strategy, the annual investment strategy. I explained briefly a minute ago the kind of background to this. It starts off by looking at the Prudential Code indicators. It explains in there what the Prudential Code is and what the purpose of these indicators are and how we report them later on in the year. And then at 4.5, it just gives a bit of content about how they deal with capital expenditure, how it's going to be funded, and limits around the external borrowing. So there is a lot of detail in there at the rear of this. But as I explained a minute ago, it's a legal requirement. I need to take this all the way to the council. Now, the second part relates to the Treasury management strategy. What you can see at page 53, the main areas covered by the strategy, it's around debt and investment and what we're projecting across this period of time, expected movements in interest rates and how that impacts on what we do, what our borrowing strategies are, and what our strategy is in terms of repaying the amounts that we've borrowed. And then the third part of this is about investment. So this is where we put cash that we have, and we may have cash for a whole number of reasons. And there are two sort of fund principles in there at 6.4 that we look to try and work to. We consider, we've got an order of things that we consider when we're making an investment. But the first of them is security, right? We then consider liquidity, how easy it is to get the money back. And lastly, the yield of return, right? But that comes last. And the other point that we work to there at that second bullet point, it's up to us to determine the investments that we make. And the strategy goes through there and identifies what we're talking about in terms of the investments that the council would look to make and the limits that we would look to work within. So going back to the recommendations, which you can see on the page 51, we're looking for approval of the indicators, the Treasury Management Strategy and the Annual Investment Strategy. So again, Chair, happy to take any questions on this.
Thank you, Paul. Does any colleague have any questions for Paul?
Councillor Allison, Chair.
Alison, Councillor Allison.
Get it right, John. Very specific one, Paul. A city deal, I believe in previous reports there's still a funding gap. Can that be quantified? And what is the risk and exposure to South Lanarkshire Council regarding that?
In terms of the funding gap, right, if I go back to this, right, but this is one which isn't covered directly in here, right, but which probably merits a wee bit of explanation and a bit of detail, which I'm happy to do offline, or if there's a general view from members that you want to have an update or a seminar on this, I'm happy to arrange that. In terms of just picking up on your question, Alec, the funding gap in relation to City Deal, what you'll remember, there's two main facts in here, and hopefully I'm touching on the origin of your question. For City Deal projects, there was an amount of money which was going in from the two governments, right, who were putting in grant in equal shares, and there was an amount that had to be contributed by the councils, right? Now, the amount that was going in from the governments was 86% from memory, and the amount from the councils was 14%. So that's factored in, that 14% is factored into our capital programmes, right? And we've got that as an item in our capital strategy. So when we were mapping out our capital programme back between sort of September and December last year, that was an item that featured in there. And when we've done a longer term capital strategy, we've factored in what we're going to have to spend there as well. There's another aspect which ties in with this report as well, and that's about the amount of borrowing we have to do. And it comes down to the fact that, see that 86% grant that we're getting, right? We don't get it all at once, right? There's two complicating factors here, right? And one of them is you get the grant over a period of 30 years. But the other side of that is we've actually been, it's no lucky, right? We've worked well within the City Deal and our projects spent first, right? So we had projects that we were able to get up and running, and you'll be aware of these by and large if you think about the big roads projects like Cathkin, Green Hills, Stewart, moving on to Stewartfield, but the first two absolutely spending ahead of most of the other cities and councils. And what that's meant, we've attracted grant disproportionately early. So it's meant we've had to do less borrowing, right? But that fact and that benefit is factored into our capital plans now. So there's dimensions of this that within the City Deal that touch in this paper, which, listen, I'm happy to talk about at greater length, or if you feel members would benefit from a sort of run through what this means and how the City Deal sits in the context of it, I'm happy to do that, Councillor Allison.
Yeah, okay, thanks just now.
Okay, thanks, Alec. Any other colleagues get questions? I see another. Sorry.
Councillor Convery, Chair.
Councillor Convery.
Thanks, John. Just a wee update. If my memory serves me right, the British government put in 600 million, Scottish government put in 600 million, and I think the council had to find 23 million.
That's right. That's your bang on, Jerry. Well done. Good memory.
So I passed the test. I read my papers, John.
Was there any other comment, Jerry? No. Okay.
No,
any other colleague? Any other colleague get anything else? Nope. I would move the recommendations.
I'll second, Chair.
Are we agreed?
Agreed.
Thanks very much. Can we move on then to item 9, which is recommendations referred from the Education Resources Committee. And Geraldine, if you could speak to this, please.
Thank you, Chair. The recommendations are set out in item 9, and they relate to the acquisition of the units at Our Lady of Lourdes Primary School. They seek approval to purchase those units, and the background to that is set out in 3.1 of the report, which explains why that is being proposed. And then they are seeking approval of the review of the admissions policy for early learning and childcare establishments, and that's set out in 3.2 of the report. That was subject to consultation in October and November last year, and the changes to the policy are set out in Appendix 1 of the report at page 81 to 83. Taking you back to recommendations, Education Resources Committee approved this and referred it on for the Executive Committee approval, and likewise with the review of the admissions policy. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Geraldine. Does any colleague have any questions? No, I would move the recommendation.
I'll second, Chair.
Can we agree, colleagues?
Agreed.
Agreed. Thank you very much. I think that concludes the business of today. No other business scheduled, so I thank everyone for taking the time to turn up, and I look forward to meeting most of you on the Climate Change Committee, which follows this. Thanks very much for your attendance. Bye.
John, Maureen and Peter, could you hold on for a minute, please?
Yes, thanks.
Thanks, Chair.
Pauline. Pauline.